Okay. Good evening and welcome to Chasing the Facts. I'm Sam Chase, your host, and with us this evening is Town Manager Paul Cohen. How are you, Paul?
Great. Thank you for having me, Sam.
I can't, it's been a long time since you've been on the show, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't remember the last time I was on the show. That's how long it's been.
You do such a good job at the select board meetings getting information out. I guess I haven't felt the need that, you know, we really need to sit down and talk, but I think it's overdue, so I'm glad you're here, and we'll talk about things that are going on in Chelmsford, obviously, and maybe a couple of items that are on the upcoming fall town meeting warrant. So let's see, you've been in town how many years?
It'll be 18 years this Thanksgiving.
2006.
Yeah.
Yes. I remember that when you started. Yes, it was right after Thanksgiving.
Yep.
At that point. So you've seen a lot of ebb and flow in the town, politics and things that have come and gone. How many select boards have you served with? Do you even remember at this point?
It's got to be at least 24 select board members.
Wow.
Over that 18 years, easily.
Yeah, because we've had several that have only done one term in the last 10 or 12 years, which when I first moved to Chelmsford back in '79, that was unusual. I mean, it was more usual to have 4- and 5-term select board members, but there's been obviously more turnover since.
A few constants. I mean, Pat Wojcik and George Dixon have been there almost the entire time that I've been there, but it's the other three that
I think George may be the longest serving.
Yes.
6 terms, I think, is the longest. Yeah, so he's become a fixture, I guess. Yeah. But that's. But anyway, you're here, and things are going, I would say, relatively smoothly. We just interviewed Jay Lang, and of course, we always talk about the relationship that you and the superintendent have. Which how would you characterize that?
Great relationship. I mean, first I'll just say the town's very fortunate to have Jay Lang leading our school department. As you know, that's the largest use of our municipal resources in terms of budget and otherwise, but it's also the big asset to the community in terms of the value of the community, the value of the property in the community, and the benefit that we provide to Chelmsford and to the region in terms of the educational output of our students. So, we're very fortunate. Jay's very forthright, transparent, great partner to work with. I've been very blessed to have had these recent years to work with Jay.
And yes, I think that's a very accurate characterization. And he has a feel also for the municipal sense too. I mean, he's just not so totally focused on schools to the exclusion of everything else. He understands that it's part of a larger whole, and you don't always see that with school superintendents.
Well, I think part of it is his background came from the finance part.
Exactly.
And it's not to knock others who may have come from more traditional educational background in terms of former teacher, principal, and so forth. But I think, like you said, he understands the finances of the operation, and also how those finances are limited, but also how they can be best allocated.
Right. And we don't have to look too far to other communities that are within our immediate vicinity to see that relationship doesn't always go that smoothly, and what results come from that, which fortunately we've been spared. But again, we have 2 good top-notch professionals at the head of the realm in both the municipal and the school side. So we're very fortunate, and we want that to continue. You're not thinking of retiring anytime soon,
Not in the near future.
Good.
But I also think that Jay and I are well served by the, supported by the boards that we work with.
I
think
agree
that's the key. When you've got the finance committee, select board, and school committee on the same page, you come in with a coherent plan. Not that we don't disagree on some issues and so forth, but you come in with a coherent plan that has been vetted and worked upon, and I think that explains why it's worked so well at town meeting.
Well, that's a good segue into another subject, the structure of government that we have in Chelmsford. And for the benefit of our viewers, there are several different possibilities if you live in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You can be a traditional city with an elected mayor and a city council. You can be a city with a so-called council manager form of government, Plan E, I think it is. And then if you're not a city, you can be a town like Chelmsford that has the so-called strong town manager form of government, where the select board acts more as a board of directors. Or you can have a smaller town like Carlisle, for example, where the board actually runs the operation of the town. So How do you feel about that situation? Do you feel that Chelmsford is being best served by the current structure that we have, which is strong town manager and elected town meeting?
Yeah, representative town meeting
right.
form. Yeah, I think it works, and it has worked. The question is what's in the future? And why I say that is, I think we've all seen the lack of volunteers in recent years. And I think that's the concern: is if you've got a community of 3,600 people, but yet there's only 200 to 300 that are actively involved, and you don't see many contested races, and even town meeting seats now are going unfilled, where you're chasing people to fill the seats.
Never thought I'd see that. When I first joined town meeting back in the mid-'90s, people fought for those seats, and we had, I think it was 6 seats that ran each year. And typically you'd get 9 or 10 people running for 6 seats. Not anymore.
Not anymore. And I think that's the concern going forward and I think it's part of the change of society. I mean, society changes and therefore you'll have to evolve with it. For example, you all see the lack of locally owned businesses. When I sit at the select board meetings, and I know you watch or attend many of them, very seldom do you see a license applicant who's local. Whether it's for a restaurant or that kind of business.
Very true.
And I think therefore that sort of also diminishes the local participation in the town. So, you don't have the days of the town meeting restaurant and even now like something like Brick House is no longer locally owned.
Right.
And you had Andiamo's and so forth. So again, when you see that fraying, you're like, well, if is the business community still engaged? Are the residents engaged? Because think about most of the recent housing that's been built have been multifamily housing, which tend to turn over, particularly rental. And so I think that's the concern. So I think at some point, not in the near future, but in the probably mid-future, maybe at the end of the decade or sometime thereafter, it'll be a question of does representative town meeting still work, or do you look towards a council form of government like Franklin has, and communities that are sort of taking that next step. And I know other towns are looking at that as well.
We would never go backwards.
We wouldn't go backwards. No, open town meeting. So you're still kind of amazed that towns like Dracut and Tewksbury
which is over 30,000 people.
Right, but
how do they do it?
Yeah. And then what happens is when they do have a huge issue, then they get overwhelmed, and like Westford, you're meeting outside the football field and stadium, where that's probably best suited for a ballot box, not for a legislative function. So I think at some point, whether it's a decade from now or what have you, there may be a question of, would a 9-person council manager form of government best serve the community? And then my guess is they would look at communities that have adopted that form and say what are the pluses minuses, because if you said if you're having the difficulty filling the vacancies, and the town's getting larger in terms of population and complexity, then the question is that more effective than having vacant positions at town meeting and also uncontested races at the local level? I mean, I think we've seen, unfortunately, the downside of uncontested races at the state level in terms of the lack of what's the right word, connection or responsiveness to the local communities.
Look at the current primary ballots.
Right. Yeah, it's very disappointing because would you have seen the same impact on questions like MBTA zoning, accessory dwelling units, some of the liquor license issues and so forth, if there were contested primaries and contested general election races? And I think so. If you then apply that down to, and also none of our Congress people are contested either.
Nope.
So then the question, if you then bring that down to the local level, can that same, sort of disconnect occur at the local level if you don't have contested races locally?
Well, unfortunately,
so again, it's not attacking any individual; it's just attacking the structure.
And the overall political system in the country. I mean, I think people are very exasperated at this point at the national level, have been for several years, and then that trickles down to the state, and people are just turned off on politics. And unfortunately, that cascades down to the local level. And you tell people, you say, listen, if you don't do anything else, vote in your local election, because that's where, especially in Massachusetts, that's where the services are delivered and you have the most impact. But to your point, if you can't even get people if you can't even have contested select board races or school committee races, the two top positions on the ballot, that's tough. That's tough. I mean, they're volunteer. The thing that disturbs me is that these are volunteer positions. People, and a lot of people don't understand that and don't even believe it when you tell them, okay? Select board members and Chelmsford school committee members do not receive any form of compensation. It's a tough job. If those jobs are done correctly, you can easily put 15 to 40 hours a week into those jobs. If you do them correctly, you keep up with all the reading and the research that you have to do to be an effective select board or a school committee person. And it's just, it's tough. It's tough to get people into those roles. And then, of course, I think social media has negatively impacted it, because you make a decision and the next thing you know, you're trashed all over Facebook and whatever they're calling that other thing now. What is it?
X or Twitter.
Okay. Well, you have to move to Brazil if you want to escape that, because
And then I think if you look at other parts of the country,
Right.
they're running, more council form of government.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
This town meeting form is obviously unique to New England, but as society becomes more mobile, and people, like I said, is that next generation going to remain in Chelmsford, or is it going to be different people who come from outside of the region? Then that's where I say it could fray, and you may go more towards a council form of government, because we see it regularly. People come in and they're looking for the mayor, or they don't understand, or they're looking for the water department and so forth, and they don't understand, how the nuances, and how would they, quite frankly, unless you're.
Hey, you have people lived in Chelmsford 30 years that don't understand the water department structure,
Exactly.
because
So.
I don't know if we're unique in that. I mean, it was common when I was a kid. The town I grew up in, we had 2 water districts that were not part of the town.
Right.
But they fixed that in the late 50s, and we still have that.
But even look inside of town. If you got an issue with the schools, you go to the superintendent
That's it.
or the school committee, right?
Yeah.
That's where you go.
Right.
So why wouldn't it then transpose that if it's going to be the rest of the town someday, it may be the manager and the council?
Right.
Kind of similar to the school committee.
Right,
So
exactly.
that's what I'm saying. So that could be the next evolution in a decade or so.
Well, you and I have had these, you know how I feel about the subject, so I think we're ready for that next step, and have been for a while. But, we've got a charter review coming up in another 2 years, so that would be the time to look at it. The last time we went through it, that issue was raised at the first meeting, and it was about a 30-second discussion. Nobody had any interest in talking about changing the form of government for Chelmsford. And so that's where people were at that time. Maybe in 2 years, maybe people will be ready to have that conversation. Be interesting to see,
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the stresses are in 2 years.
Right.
Because we're coming into a pretty tough period ahead of us.
Yes.
Fiscally.
Let's talk about that a little bit. One thing I think that you've always been very good at is trying to plan for the future. And it's tough because we're Americans and we're short-term thinkers, most of us, and we don't like to look forward to the next step. But in your business, I think if you don't do that, it's death, right?
Yeah.
So.
Or it's mobility, one or the other.
It's
'Cause that's what
mobility.
happens, right?
Yeah.
They move on.
They move on or you move on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one or the other. Yeah,
That's
exactly.
it,
And that's sad.
Yeah, and a lot of times the municipality do that and nothing changes, because it's the situation, not the person.
Right.
But I think you've done a pretty good job trying to prepare the community through the select board and any of the outlets that you have to get out to the community, that perhaps in the near future we won't be facing such good economic circumstances. And I think part of the problem is that we came off of COVID and we had a lot of one-time money given to us. And one of the things that I think you did, and the school department did it as well, and here you have to give the select board some credit, because they were the ones that were,
Allocated
correct me if I'm wrong, they were the ones making the call as to where the money
On the ARPA, on the town
on the
side,
ARPA was going.
The school
School
committee
was different.
had different
Right,
monies
right.
that went directly to that.
But wisely, but if you and the board were together on this issue, the monies need to be allocated towards one-time capital type projects. I noticed that a lot of the towns around us, and some what people would say was pretty smart towns, didn't do that. They went out and they hired people, and they created what are recurring expenses. And now they're having to pull back. But we're not doing that.
No, because you would be facing the cliff.
Right.
You know, it's sort of what the state had to do with the housing of the migrants, right?
Yes.
We funded, and all of a sudden it's like, we don't have the money anymore. And then we changed the policy to universal care to
Uh-oh.
5 days.
Yes.
Yeah, so well, wait a minute. You told us for years you had a law that
Yeah.
everybody was guaranteed shelter, and then all of a sudden it became a 5-day subject to what
Right.
funds were available.
Right.
And I think people start scratching their head saying, well, what happened? And what we didn't want to do was avoid the cliff. But, and as you said, we directed it to one-time expenditures for, many things that people didn't physically see,
And
HVAC
and
in
good
schools
ones.
and
Right.
those kind of things.
Yeah.
Because the time the thinking was, well, the money was meant in response to COVID. Well, why don't we deal with the impacts of COVID? And what the issue was you had facilities like, the schools that were, 50 plus years old who didn't have the correct ventilation and those type of issues. And so that was why it was there. But the bigger challenge, wasn't how do you spend one-time monies on one-time expenses. The bigger challenge to cities and towns was the inflation that came with the rescue plan. Because if you had 20% inflation in a 5-year period, well, Proposition 2.5 doesn't work in high inflation.
It does not.
That's why it's called 2.5, because
Exactly.
the increase in the allowable, tax base, absent growth, is 2.5%.
Right.
So if you have inflation that was running at one point over 9%, and even in recent years was 3%, 3.5%, well, 2.5 doesn't work. And that's why you see the Drakeits, the Westfords hit the wall, and we're coming right in behind them, hitting that same barrier. And I presented the report to the select board about 6 months ago, and to the finance committee saying, look, we're going to run into a problem in FY26. And right now we're sort of compiling the estimates from the department heads and looking at the close of 24. And right now the early signs aren't good. What we're seeing is inflation is been the target of the municipal challenge. For example, we just received a report in the last month from the Middlesex County Retirement System. They're required every 2 years to do an actuarial valuation of the pension system to fully fund it in 2037. They notified us, in our case, that our assessment is going to go up by 8.4% next year, followed by 6.5% the second year of the 2-year cycle. So again, 2.5 doesn't go into 8.4 or 6.
Well, and that's the thing that people
Right.
need to take a look at and understand. They might get the stats from the government. I mean, we just heard one. Well, no, we've got inflation under control. It's 2.6. Well, folks, you have to understand that is an aggregate number of the so-called economic basket of goods that they use to predict. But you've got some sectors where the inflation has been 50 and 60% and 30%. I mean, you look at utilities, okay? I mean, talk for a minute about our electricity, the aggregate thing. So my bill has gone up almost 40%, which was predictable because I'm on the town's program, which I think
Which was a better rate than the
excellent.
market. Yeah.
Yes, excellent program. So we're saving money there. But, somebody who's looking at their utility bill, try explaining to them that inflation is under control at 2.6%. That's not going to wash.
And the same thing's
Okay.
happening with healthcare.
Exactly.
We're expecting that our healthcare increase would be around 8.5 to 9%. Again, 2.5 doesn't go into that. And these aren't just sort of trivial aspects of the town's budget. We're spending about 16 million, or about a tenth of our budget on healthcare, and we're spending about 11 million on retirement.
On retirement.
So when you're already hitting that, never mention the wage inflation. People are mobile. We see that there's a worker shortage. So the leverage was with the employees to get pay increases, and everybody wants a living wage.
Of course.
But the problem is if you're then granting increases that are above, in the town's case, a 2.5%, 3% or so, then how do you sustain it? Nobody, believe me, nobody wants to take advantage of anyone. But when you see, hotel workers that are currently out on strike saying, well, I can't work for $31.22 an hour, for a 40-hour week, you're like, well, but what kind of an increase do you expect? And some of it may be legitimate. Everybody, who wants to deny somebody the sanctity of a home and health care and
No one.
and a quality of life? But then how does it work at the government level if you're constrained by 2.5? Because if you don't meet those challenges, you're going to lose workers, or you're not going to be able to fill the positions, and that's the challenge. And we're like I said, we're hitting that right now. And All the town's bargaining agreements expire at the end of this year in roughly 10 months. But those increases for the last 3 years were 2.5%.
Right.
So obviously the mindset of labor is, well, we're not going to, we need to catch up. We can't sustain on 2.5%.
And you can't
And you can't blame them.
you cannot
Nobody's
fault the
blaming
unions
anybody.
for asking what they think is
Yeah,
fair.
and the
No, you
non-union
can't.
employees,
Right.
you can't blame them. But then the
Yeah.
question becomes, well, then how does government survive? And if you can't get the override, and those overrides are, we saw in Westford, it failed. Chelmsford hasn't had an operational override since 1992 on trash.
And people were actually surprised
Yeah.
about the Westford result, because
Yeah.
that's a relatively wealthy community, and there was
And they're seeing the impacts, but the problem is it doesn't end in 1 year. It's not like, oh, that's done. You're
Right.
going to come back next year
Yep.
and face the same challenges, and it compounds. It's
so
a big challenge.
so what the municipalities have to do is what the folks in the private sector have to do. You have to look at reducing scope of programs, and that ultimately you're talking people, because the town is in a service business. We don't manufacture a product, we provide a service. And it's tough. So,
But the demand for service doesn't diminish. That's the
It-
difference from the private sector.
it increases.
And we've seen that in education in
Yep.
particular. You've got
Yep.
more and more children who need individualized educational plans. You need additional aides in the classrooms. You need school counselors. You need school resource officers. Again, they're justified, but the question becomes, how do you fund it? And the problem
That's
is,
exactly right.
and I think the difference was, back when Proposition 2.5 was enacted, Governor Dukakis, and then even going more recent terms in terms of like Governor Weld and Salucci and so forth, they were partners with cities and towns. And they sort of filled the gap. So the towns would tax to the levy limit and the state would share revenue. What we saw in the recent
that
years...
was the expectation,
Right.
yes.
But what we saw in recent years was, the state would exceed its revenues and spend money, but then the towns were like, well, you
minute.
left us behind.
Yeah.
You thought your budget was going to grow by 4%, it ended up growing by 7%, but you didn't share any back with the
Let's talk
cities and
about
towns.
Chapter 90.
Yeah, exactly.
A perfect example, right?
Same funding level for
10, 12 years?
13 years
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
And they say, well, it's supplemented with the millionaire's tax. Well, okay, that's fine, but even if you take that into account, you're still not where your buying power that you were a dozen or 13 years ago.
Let's hope the millionaires stay in Massachusetts.
Yeah. And so that's the challenge. And,
Yeah.
and the biggest complaint we receive is road conditions.
Oh, of course, because the potholes are visible.
General government
Right.
level, and they're visible. It's transparent. And if you say we've allocated more and more funding, and we're going to do it again this fall town meeting. We'll propose it again to put more money into the roads because it's a form of infrastructure that is constantly utilized, meaning it wears down, right? You pave a road, it doesn't mean, oh, that's done for 100 years like a pipe in the ground. You're then going to come back in 7, 10, 20 years, depending upon the amount of
you're lucky.
traffic that goes on
Right.
the road. So we were out there doing Drum Hill Road, recently, and we're out there on Stedman Street at the current time. It's because the volume of traffic that goes on those roads, just like the highways. Why do they pave the highways so often? Because they're so heavily traveled.
Exactly.
It's the same thing in the town. We've got to maintain Drum Hill Road, North Road, and so forth. And you say, well, why is that essential? Because if you don't maintain it, then you not only lose the road surface, you lose the road base. And that becomes ridiculously expensive.
Yeah, exactly.
To rebuild the road base.
Exactly.
So I feel bad for people who come in and say, hey, my cul-de-sac or minor collector road hasn't been paved recently. It's like, well, what would you have us do? One is the speeds on your roads, minor roads and cul-de-sacs is much less than they're doing 40 or whatever on Littleton Road or or North Road or Chelmsford Street. So that's the reason why, it's the same reason why the state keeps the highways in decent condition is because you're going at a faster speed, which is a safety issue.
The one thing I've noticed that has changed over the last couple of years, and I think you've had a good focus now on your Department of Public Works, and Christine Clancy, in my opinion, was just a terrific hire.
I'm very fortunate.
And she's highly organized, and having somebody who's a civil engineer at the head of that job. And one thing I've noticed, things now, and maybe they always were, but it wasn't obvious to the public. What is now obvious to the public is that these things are scheduled, they're thought about in advance, and the town has a definite purpose. Okay, tomorrow we're going to do this street, 6 months later we're going to do this street. And that may have always been, but I don't think that was the perception in the community.
Yeah.
So it's great to see, your department heads managing in that way. And I think, it does instill a lot of confidence.
Yeah, and some of it you don't see. Like if they're
No, you don't.
they're rebuilding the pump station at Milan Avenue. Nobody sees that, but
No.
you'd see it if it didn't fail. The bigger challenge of that, though, as you said, is connecting with people.
Exactly.
The local media, print media, is essentially vanished.
What media?
Exactly. And so the biggest challenge we have is
Right.
how do we connect with people?
Yeah.
People will watch this show. People will watch.
I think we're up to 25 people now.
Yeah, select board meetings. I put out a newsletter monthly. We try to use social media.
Yes.
But the big challenge is how do you connect with people? Because, again, people live very busy lives.
Busy.
They've got, there's generally two parents working, and when the house price to get into town is $600,000, you almost have to have two working parents.
Oh, tell me about it.
And then if they have children and so forth, well, then, again, it's not because it's just they're busy.
Right.
And so trying to capture their attention is a challenge. And that's really, again, it goes back to our initial discussion of how do you connect with people. One is you got to outreach, but also they got to want to be connected.
That's exactly right.
And so it's a two-sided coin, and that's the biggest challenge is because generally you don't hear from somebody until there's a problem, right? And that's
Well,
the
Dick
challenge
Mosher
of
always said nobody cares until it affects them.
Yeah.
And I think that's just basic human nature. We got a couple minutes left, but one thing I want to ask you about is this last year we've had quite a few personnel changes in town, and that seems to be working.
Working
okay?
well, yeah. I mean, we've noticed in the last few months the labor pool is better in terms of applicants for positions, but we just had a bunch of retirements. It really hasn't been people leaving to go to other communities or other lines of work.
Sue Rosa, Frank Green.
Chief Spinney.
Jim
you go
Spinney,
through, and Mike Donahue. It goes on and on. Jeannie Parzielli, our HR director.
That was big because Jean was what, 30 years and
Yeah,
plus?
over 30 years.
Yeah.
Over 30 years with the town. So it just, and then we've seen a big turnover in the police department. Again, because they aged out. And so that's the challenge is you've got to, fortunately, some of those you can see ahead of time, so we can plan for them accordingly. And Chelmsford is a good-sized community, and I think it's got a good reputation. And so I think that makes us capable that we can go out and recruit and hire people.
Yes.
Like a Christine Clancy who was working for the city of Lowell and said, I'll come over to Chelmsford. That was a blessing for us. So those are the big challenges is keeping, we're only as good as the people who work for you. It's just like the Patriots, they're only as good as the players on the team.
Absolutely right, absolutely right. And I think we're very fortunate in Chelmsford, the level of employee we have both on the municipal and school side. I mean, I continually marvel at the quality of the teaching staff that we have in town. I mean, they're outstanding, and the same can be said of the municipal staff. I don't think I've ever heard anybody tell me that they've gone into town hall and had a bad experience in terms of the way they've been treated. They might not have gotten the answer they wanted, but at least they were treated in a very professional and courteous manner. That is not the case in all towns. I know, because I've been in other town halls, and that says a lot for your organization and your ability to make sure that you've got the right people in the managerial positions. So I know we've had the change. The big change was HR, and Lisa Maroney has now taken over that role.
Yep.
And she certainly is a ball of fire, and I think will do well. And we have a new chief assessor in the assessor's office, and she seems to be working out very well.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's all good stuff. I mean, people don't like change, but again, if you anticipate
Change is constant.
there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
The trick is to try to be forward-thinking and anticipatory, and try to make sure you've got the candidates that you need to have in order to go. And your management style is to hire competent people and let them do their job, and that's the key.
No, that's the key. Yeah,
Don't micromanage your people.
You can't micromanage your people. It's just physically impossible.
Yeah. Well, some people try.
And to their own demise.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. I think most of us that worked in management, I know I had to learn. That was a hard lesson for me to learn because I tend to be a little bit on the control freak side. But by the time I was 40, I realized can't do that. You got to get good people, let them do their job, and You're there to be a resource for them and make sure that they have the tools that they need to succeed. And I think you do that very well. Paul, we're out of time. I can't believe it.
Okay.
So next show, you and Jay Lang together.
Okay.
What do you think?
That'll be fine.
I think that's a good show. What do you think, Jack?
I do.
Okay. All right.
Thank
So,
you for having me.
thank you.
Appreciate it.